name's Nathan Boot.
Let's try to do some carving today. I will walk you through a fairly simple project, nothing too exciting, just kind of a simple detail on a small block. I love to do details like this for window trim, or even I've used similar type things for lids on boxes. You can just carve a simple design like this and then add it to the box, or do something like this right in the top of a box. It's I found the design and then changed some of it to match what I kind of wanted to do, but and I'll show a picture of the original design I found, and then I can show you how I changed it. I can also put a drawing up that you can download if you would like. It's easy to transfer. I just use carbon paper to transfer designs like this. This one I'm just going to draw right on the block right here. This one I did as a practice, but also that way I'll have two when I'm done. Now, the first thing I like to do is you have to attach your block to something solid. I have this board I clamp down onto my bench, and then all I do to make it stay in place, because a block like this is kind of hard to clamp down by itself, so I just use hot glue, and 4 dabs in the corners tends to be all you need to get it to hold. So I put that on here, hold it for a few seconds, and now it's usually pretty attached. Sometimes I've had them pop off, but I always try to keep a balance between too much glue and too little glue. Too much glue and it's a real pain to get off. Too little and it pops, so it'll come off. So the next step, we then are drawing the design. Where did I put my pencil? I got a pencil here. I've got my square right here. And so first off, I need to measure the center. I always like to find my center point. So it's 5.5, 2 3/4, 5.5, 2 3/4. And then I'm going to draw in some lines here. Now, that's kind of a good starting point. And then what I'll do is I'll use my pattern I made to get all of my measurements from. So, first measurement is going to be this center design. So, you draw that on. And then I'll measure this part. There's not too many, too much. I tend not to do too much for drawing, because once you start carving, it all disappears anyway. But you do need those marks to tell you where you're carving. It's always a balance. Sometimes, for something like this, I tend to do a little more drawing, because the lines will stay. And then this line is just a reference point, which that one will probably end up changing a little bit, but for now that'll work just fine. Now we're going to draw in the 45s so that I know where the different leaves for the petals are divided. Now, I tend sometimes to not even bother drawing in all of the detail before I start, because I find a lot of times as I'm carving I end up making a mess. and smearing all the lines as it is. So over the years I've found just draw as you go along. There's no need to get too carried away. If you draw too much detail, it just gets erased anyway. So for this part, I'm going to draw in the petals, and there's a little bit of figuring here. So first off, finding the point I need to mark those. So find a center. I think I was a little far. That first line was off, so I'm going to draw another line. Then this is the inside point for the petals. And so now I can go back. Just gives me one more little reference point. So a little less. Here's that, and then so there we go. So I just use the compass to find my point. Okay, that gives me, and again, I'm not usually too worried about super accuracy, because I'll show you in a second what I also use. So sometimes this can be a little bit of a process, but all I'm really trying to do is get my points set up. I think I messed up a little there. There we go. That's better. Sometimes you just have to kind of move things around, try a few different things to get the right. There we go. That's a little more what I was looking for. Now, let's see here. So I mark that, check that, and that. Perfect. I had that inside line a little too far back. I think we're in good shape. That'll work. All right. Now, the first part of this we're going to want to carve. It's going to be, you want to cut the backgrounds out and leave technically the foreground, I guess you would call it, the details. And what I like to do is, you look at your gouges, they have different numbers, and that references the different amount of curve. A 7 is not as curved as an 8. And then even a 9, of course, is even more curved. But those numbers just give you the angle of that curve, and a 5 is a little bit flatter, all the way down to a 1, which is just flat. And so when I'm making a cut like this, you want to do a relief cut, they're called. That's where you're going to be using this to make a relief cut. It takes all right, there we go. Let's try that again. So what I'll do is, and I use the 7 to help lay out. You can see I kind of am matching that curve. And again, I oftentimes won't get too worried if it's not exactly perfect. So when I'm making the cuts too, you'll notice it's at an angle. I'm cutting deeper on the inside because I want it deeper inside, and I don't need to go as deep on the outside. So you angle it a little, and then you can twist it a little bit, and that kind of adds the cut. Because if you were to keep going, you could do a circle of a certain size with this. Each gouge can do a larger circle, the flatter the gouge. And so I'm just going to go around. You make a relief cut to begin, because it's easier and faster usually to make the same cut over and over. And you're going to be doing it multiple times anyway, so I find it easiest to just do it all at the same time. And you'll notice I'm a little off here and there, but there will be more cleanup anyway as I go. This is just to get the idea, just to get this started. And you'll see I'm not exactly even perfectly on the lines. The lines were just to lay out to get things where they needed to be. I oftentimes will use the chisel's curve to finalize where things are. Alright, so I've gone around, I've made all those relief cuts. Now I can come back, and for this I'm going to use a 5 because I want it a little bit shallower, closer to flat. But if I use a flat, I can't get in there. You'll see what I mean. And now I often will just touch up my chisels as I go, real quick. And I'll do a video on sharpening one of these days if you guys are interested. You can see years ago I just made this block, and it's worked so well ever since. I just haven't had time or really a need to make a new one. So what we do, there are a few things to account for. One being the grain. You can see grain direction running this way, so you want to cut with the grain. Across the grain is always more challenging. I think too, let me turn on the other light here, get a little more light. There we go. You can see, you kind of just, as I go, there's one. We're just removing this, trying to get to the line. And if you're at all having trouble, what you can do too is just do a practice one. Make a bunch of these marks and practice them on something else, and then come back to your piece. See? So sometimes you just have to kind of vary the direction you're cutting, come in at an angle. Now another thing I should probably mention, I'm using some oak. I just picked that because I had it lying around. But oak is a harder wood to carve. It's a hardwood and therefore harder to carve. And it does tend to splinter a bit. You can kind of see that. As I go, I'll clean that up a little more. There's a lot more to do, so I don't tend to worry too much about splinters now as it chips out, but that is something to think about. To begin with, I would really recommend using basswood. It's a very soft wood and it carves very well. It's what you see most sculpture carving, especially like carousel horses, or even a lot of paneled or mirrors would often be carved in basswood because it is such an easy wood to carve and it carves really well. I've also used poplar. I really do like poplar as well. But you'll see, you can carve I've carved pretty much every kind of wood, but some certainly are easier than others, and some are very difficult. I do like pine as well. But I had these little blocks of oak, so I figured I'd do that. So we're just working our way around, not getting the bulk of the material out. You can see there's still some areas I haven't gotten to. We'll go back and clean those up in a little bit once I get more of the petals done. But this kind of lays out the original shapes and gets rid of this extra wood. So I'm starting to build up the shapes of the petals. We start there. And down in the middle there, it is hard to get to. Down in these little corners. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll take a very tiny one. You can use that to kind of clean those up too. You know, get down in there really and pop those little extra pieces out. The best thing to do is to just practice the different types of cuts you're making. You know, practice the relief cuts and practice this. Just lay out this shape a bunch on another scrap piece of wood and practice it. And then that way, when you get that down a little bit, you can come back to, say, your final piece and not be as worried, or, you know, feel more confident on your cuts. So we go around. And I'll keep doing that. These little corners are really hard to get into. So you come back with a tiny chisel that can get right in there and pop those pieces, that extra out. Then I always just developed a habit of, after every few cuts, blowing on it, and that just gets rid of the extra chips. You can just brush them out of the way, but it seems like the blowing on it makes it pretty easy. I almost don't even notice I do it anymore. It's become so second nature. And so you kind of just start. You'll notice I change chisels all the time, because each little cut, sometimes you have to do something different. Like for this part, to get in here, I have to switch up to this chisel, the fine one, to get deep, to get those little chunks out there, to clean that up. Sometimes it's stubborn getting those little pieces out. You just take your time, clean it up as you can. All right, so that's kind of a rough job of getting all this extra material out. So now we're going to come back. I'm going to do a little bit more just to finalize the shapes of these a little more. So I kind of come in here with that, the 7 again, and then I come back with the 5. And what I want to do is kind of clean up around the petals, just to get a little more of that inside circle detail. Sort of like that, see? I'm just trying to get these pieces right in here cleaned up now that I have the excess. It seems a lot of times it's a lot easier usually to go and clean out big areas and then come back and do finer detail work. That being, it usually takes a lot more force to cut the big pieces out, where the little pieces are easy to get rid of once you have a lot of the material out of the way. I do that a lot. I'll kind of just lay out the rough shape of something and then go back and add details. And you'll see I'll do that some more when I get to the various parts of the flower, some of the details on the flower. And we're just kind of picking along, cleaning that up. And you can sometimes use this kind of twisting cut, and that kind of will, I find that works really well to sort of lightly cut the wood, but also at a nice curve. So I'll go in and do that, and then twist and push down. It's hard, I'm sure, with my hands. I've been trying to figure out a good way to show the carving without having my hands in the way, but I don't know how to do that. I'll have to keep seeing. If anybody has any suggestions, I'm all ears. So I just keep working my way around. And it's all just one little piece at a time. Now, one of the things too, I guess I'll have to go over is wood grain direction. That can really be problematic while you're carving, and it's something, given time, you kind of just can easily switch and tell which directions you need to cut. But I remember years ago trying to teach a friend, and it was very difficult to explain how to read grain and know which directions to cut. There's against the grain and with the grain, and you always want to cut with the grain. There are certainly little points you can make an exception, but most of the time, whenever I try to not follow the rules on that, I have tear out. So I have come to just find it is always best to just go with the grain directions. And I don't have a really easy way to explain that. You just have to think about the fact that trees grow, and they're a vascular plant, meaning it's almost like tubes growing in a bundle of straws. I've heard it compared to, and you can kind of see that, you know, if you look at it, you see the grain is running in a linear direction, you know, and then if you look at the end, you can see the rings of the trees, the ends of the straws stacked up. And you want to cut with the along the lines of the grain, but oftentimes you're looking at it in two directions. There's this direction, but there's also this direction, and this is pretty flat, but sometimes, well, here you can see a little more, it angles a little bit, and you want to cut with the grain. If you cut this way, it'll start to chip out, and I'll probably get that here in a second. I'm going to be clearing this part out, and that usually involves cutting from multiple different directions. So let's see here. I'll get this. So first I make a relief cut again. Just get this started. And this is to lay out the centerpiece. Kind of that little knob detail. And so wherever you want your cuts to stop, you make relief cuts. And this is just, right. Now, there's going to be a lot more than that taken out, but that's a good place to start. Now, another thing I like to do here is I tend to use a deeper gouge just to help kind of clear it out, and then I'll go to a more shallow gouge to get it smoother and flatter. And so, if I cut this way, it cuts with it. If I'm cutting this way, it wants to splinter a little more. So the grain is kind of rising this way. So you want to cut with it and not down into it. I don't know. It's always been a hard thing to explain, and it seems like the best way to learn is to just take a piece of wood and try doing some cuts in it. Scrap. Like this. Here's a piece of alder. Now, if you cut into it and lift, you can see that it'll split. If I go the other direction, it's a bigger split. And so one direction you're carving into the grain, see how it catches? In this direction you can carve and it chips out because you're cutting with. You're not cutting down into the grain, you're cutting across it as it lifts up. And so just do this for some practice and you'll start to see that one way it doesn't chip out and one way it does. And you start to get a feel for it. And whenever I start carving, keep an eye on that, and it'll become second nature in just a little time. It won't take very long. You'll start to realize and see one way will chip out, one won't. It'll even change in boards. I've had it change in very small distances on carvings before, and so it's always just something to keep an eye on. And with time, you'll learn it. Just do some practice. That's the only way to get good at things, is always practice. And so I'm not too worried about making it too nice right now. I'm just removing a lot of extra material. And so I often will just do little wiggles like that to help. Now, when I am doing cuts like this, if you're just pushing, it's really easy to slip. As funny as it is, what you have to do is you put one hand here and one hand here, and you push with this hand, you push back, and you push forward. It's kind of a weird, you would seem counterproductive, but what that lets you do is it lets you have a lot of force pushing, but you're controlling it. If you just were to push with just one hand or both hands, you don't have very much control. This gives you a lot of control. You put one here in this hand, and you can really push and control exactly where you want those cuts to go. And one of the things I love about carving is it does take a bit of concentration, but I find it very peaceful and meditative, you could say. And part of that is I find myself, I'm always thinking about right here, just the very end of the chisel. Do a quick sharpening. First I do the outside, and then I do just a little touch up on the inside. And all I have is just a polish, usually like a jeweler's polish or a metal polish, and I just spread that on well, that in that case just a piece of wood, and it just kind of cleans up the very edge. You want your chisels really sharp, kind of dangerously sharp, but that's I have cut myself many times, that is, but it's always nice with the less you do that. Now, the other type of cut I like, that's a pushing cut. This is a pulling cut. And so I have this hand here and this hand here, and I do the same thing. I'm kind of pushing with one hand and controlling with the other and keeping it from sliding out of control. Gives you a lot of control. And these again are good, just do some practice cuts. You know, get an extra old scrap board or something and just try laying out a few things and practicing. I'd love to see what you guys get, what you guys do. So kind of getting, and you can see it's really rough. This is not very smooth or nice looking right now. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to get it all kind of even so that everything is about the same. And this is just, like I said, getting rid of that extra wood. So there's no need to be too worried about this step. And we just go around, smooth it out one more time, get it all fairly even. But it doesn't have to be perfect. There. And just do little relief cuts to clean that up and get all that extra material out. And now I'm going to come back in with this one. It's a number 5, and it's a wider chisel because it'll make a nice smooth cuts. So we'll just work our way back around, smoothing all of that back out. This is just getting it all equal. But this is a larger chisel, so it's a lot harder to cut bigger cuts. You're trying to remove more material. But it's a lot easier if it's just trying to smooth and remove small amounts like this. And that's why I start with that other gouge. It's just get rid of all the extra and make it easier to do this one. So we just come back and remove all that extra and smooth it all out. And I'm not too worried about it being perfectly smooth. Part of what I like about carving is leaving some marks. It's part of the charm of carving, is being able to tell that it was done by hand. So I don't bother getting it perfectly smooth. You can always sand it or touch it up with files or something, rasps, or if you want it really smooth. So you just keep working your way around, chip at a time. All right. There, that's pretty good. I might do a little more down the road, but for now, and I'm not too worried about these pieces right here, because one of the next parts I'm going to be doing is rounding this over. See, I'm just going to be building this shape up and then cutting out the center. And for that, I'm going to just go back to the number 7. And what I do on this part, in this part sometimes I start with a flatter. You can start with a number 5 or a smooth or a flatter gouge. And what I'm going to do is you're going to be removing the material to make it kind of a round button shape. And so just kind of start slow, make a cut more vertical down to the bottom, and then you can come back and take a little more to round it out like that. Just working your way. And I always start with littler cuts, because once it's gone, once the wood's gone, it's gone. You can glue it on, but it's usually easier to just try to keep it on to begin with. So kind of just go around, slowly rounding it over. And now, again, I tend not to worry too much if I'm leaving some marks. I've always enjoyed leaving some chisel marks. It kind of adds to the interest, in my opinion, of the carving. And I'll come back, do some final detail around it, sort of little relief cut, come back in, and this should kind of highlight that at that now if you want, you can go back and remove a little bit more just to try to even that out, make it look a little smoother. There we go. And you can see I made some little cuts. Those will disappear here in a second when I do my final cleanup on that. Now for this part, you can draw it in or just use your chisel, but I'll just do a quick. So I had to redraw those lines, and then we'll go back in with a smaller number 7. So I'll cut, make another relief cut to lay out those inner petals. So just real light. It's very easy to chip this piece. So do very tiny little cuts to start with. You can always add to them. Just a very light cut. And then come back, because it's very easy to chip. The smaller the piece of wood is, the easier it is to chip. And so I always do this part very carefully in an attempt to not break that piece. There's a good chance it'll break, and if that's the case, you can either adapt the carving to suit the break, to match whatever broke, or you can glue something back on. In this case, I probably would just adapt the change the carving to look a little different, but it's always easier to just take it very slow and delicate and not have to do that. So there we go. Now I'll come back and do these ones. So just slow, shallow cuts. Sometimes like that, just make it multiple times, come back, make a little more, until you get the pieces out you want. Sometimes it feels just like you're half sanding it, just taking tiny little cuts. There we go. Now, one thing I liked was there's kind of a button in the middle, a little bit of a detail, and sometimes for that, so I don't remember exactly, I think it was a number 3 fishtail. I'll have to look and find that original carving set I got, and I'll leave a description down in the description, a link to the one. But then I just come back with another small chisel and clean to add that little bit of a more detail right in the corners. Kind of like that. Makes it look just a little more interesting. There we go. Now there's still a little bit of fuzz kind of, but I'll show you. There's a trick for that at the end. Now for this part, it does help. I tend to will just draw them in. They might be a little wiggly, but I'll show you. So you just kind of come back in, get these points to start dividing up the petals. See, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just laying it back out. And if you need to, you can always use, you know, your 45 degree again, just to kind of see it. You can't, you know, it's going to be different if you, but you can kind of use it as a guide to get those perfect. You know, again, I find it, usually I just kind of eyeball it. It's usually not too hard to see what you got to do. Now, again, I'm going to be using, now for this part, I use V parting chisel, and that's got an actual, it's a V shape, so they call it a V parting. And again, I like to just really quickly run it across my very fancy polishing stone here, which actually it's not a stone at all, I'm kidding. It's a piece of 1/4 inch plywood that I glued a piece of cereal box to backwards. And so it's just that soft cardboard, and it works really well. You can rub your polish on there and it holds it well. And then for the inside, I angled it, and so I just can fit it right over the edge like that, and I just kind of run that across there a few times. And then flip it and do it the other way. And that kind of removes any burr on the inside, so you got a nice sharp chisel. And then again, I'm going to just cut in these lines. And so I always start kind of shallow, because you can adjust as you need to. You can kind of clean it up as you go. Start with a small cut and get into a bigger cut. Make it as deep as you want. Okay. So then I come just work my way around. Start small. And again, this is kind of one of those things you can kind of practice. I've done a lot of different carving just with a V parting chisel. You could do some amazing things with them. But a good thing to do is just kind of lay out some lines and try following them. It takes a little practice to get them to cut straight. The grain will push the chisel sometimes, especially in this type of cut. So it takes a little practice. And then I'll come back over here. And so I'm just cutting whatever feels most comfortable to you. You can use a mallet if you need to. Sometimes I do. Just depends on what I need to do. Just come around. Make those cuts. Sometimes they're a little awkward. There you go. That kind of gets those. And then I just go back, and these ones you can draw in or not. I just do, again, lighter lines to add in the details. I do one long one and then two shorter ones. That. And you know, you can lay those out more accurately if you want with your compass and a ruler or something, but part of what I like about, like I said, carving is a lot of times it's not all exactly the same, you know. That's part of what makes it hand carved, is it's going to be a little bit different. I try to make these kind of light cuts, nothing too deep. So you just work your way around. And I think I'm going to stain these, and I'll show you a picture at the end. The stain will kind of build up in these and really highlight them. Highlight these. Sometimes you gotta kind of stand up too. This one petal, it's kind of a weird angle to try to carve. Just get in there. I'm gonna get up a little crooked. I don't think it looks bad though. All right. So there's that. Now I want to go back and do one final little cleanup of the petals. What I'm going to do, just kind of go back, do one last pass. Let's see, I think actually I'm going to go with that number 3, this one. I like the fishtail. Those little, they're called a fishtail gouge because they're thin and then they expand. But what's really nice is that expanded part lets you get down into the bottom, into areas that the other ones, it's a little harder to reach. So I'm just going to go around, do one more final detail in there. Bring those up just a little more. Make those little, where the two petals come together, a little more of a sharp V. Give it a little more, I guess, definition. And I probably need to go back with my smaller gouge even. So oftentimes I'll kind of go back and revisit a spot in the carving that, as I've moved on, found, you know, it needs maybe a little more. But it's getting pretty. That'll kind of work. It's looking good. Kind of the main flower is done. You know, you can always go back and clean it up a little more if you need to. But yeah, that's looking pretty good. Now that I have that part done, I'm going to do these little outside details. Just that little leaf detail. And now I can draw them in because I'm done with the inside, where you can see I've kind of worn away some of the line already, and so that's why I tend to wait on that, because it just gets smudged anyway, and then you just have to redraw it. So I'm just going to go around here. There we go. And now for this part, sometimes you can make a little pattern out of cardboard or something, or a little harder paper, but a lot of times I just sketch it in there because it's just as easy. So for this one, I was just doing that. and that, just to get, see, and so, and then for this, it doesn't have to be perfect, and as soon as I start cutting, it will remove the line anyway. So I just am laying out so that I know where, roughly, where to cut. Again, sometimes it's easier, like I said, to make a pattern, but it's also sometimes a lot easier and quicker just to sketch it in there. They're all going to be very similar, and I'll show you how I can tell that. Now, the first part is you got to remove some of the material, but for this I don't do a relief cut. I'm just going to use my V-parting chisel and run it down here with the one edge right cutting the circle. So I'm not quite on my line. I'm using this edge to cut that line. I'm not centered on it. And for this, I always like to use a chisel, or a mallet, I mean, with my chisel. It makes it really easy. You just make tiny little taps, and it just slides right through there, and you kind of just move it as you need, like that. You can just go back and kind of refine it as needed. It's really easy. So I'm going to make that cut. Just laying, and I'm just removing the material enough so that the next cut will go easily. Same with this one. I'm just getting rid of enough to start the next cut. So we do that, and I'm not going to cut those other two, and I'll show you in a second. So again, I'm just using the one edge to cut that circle. So I'll just go to there. It starts to get a little awkward. This one, and just, you're always adjusting which way you're cutting as needed. Whatever, I often find I'll just switch a cut just to make it whatever way I find easiest, because they tend to turn out better that way. And so it's easier to cut this part than to try to reach all the way over that other part. And I can just meet the two there. Now, one thing to keep track of too is how much you're rolling your chisel. You can cut, you can roll it different directions, and you want to keep it nice and straight so it makes a nice even cut. And this is another point that will get you sometimes with cutting with the grain. A V-parting, it'll chip out easily, so sometimes it's good to do little cuts and kind of get a feel for which direction the grain is going before you get too deep into your cuts, because it will splinter out. And you can see I kind of made a little extra there off the side, so I'm going to kind of even that out a little bit. Come back this way as well. I use a V-parting a lot to clear out material to do other cuts. These are just kind of relief cuts of sort. And a lot of times I'll just go around and do the same cut on each part, like this, because it makes it, because I don't know, it seems kind of easier to do the same cut over and over than to switch each time. It goes a little faster, but also I find that I do a better cut by doing it that way. probably because I've just been repetition of something seems to make it a little easier. So I'm just working my way around, getting that excess wood out of the way. And I'll probably even come back and do this again, but it's just getting that first layout. Now, and then one final. Okay, so we just come back. There we go. That'll work. Getting that cleared out. Now, I'll come back in with my number 7. Where did I set it? Here. And I'll make some more relief cuts. Now this is where I wasn't too worried because about drawing it all perfectly. It was more just to lay it out, because this one will define these cuts a little more. You can see that there's, what I do is I use the corner, and using just the width of the gouge tells me where I need to be. In a sense, like this one's too far out, it sticks over on this side, so I just bring it back to where it needs to be, even if my drawing wasn't in that exact spot. It's just a way to, you know, lay out the drawings. Just helps me get it where I started. And then I use the actual chisel to decide the spots. There's that one, and then I'll come back this way. That one. So I use this one, and where that one ends, I come back and use this one to meet it. So really, there we go. Now, come back, I'll remove this excess. Again, doing those background cuts, relief cuts, to get all that extra material out. Now this part, we'll have to come back with it another. There's that, and then for that little tiny corner, I'll come back with my really small. There we go. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of work to get those deep pockets cleared out. Like that. Just working my way around. Again, little chip outs aren't a big issue. I'll be cleaning this up a little more once I get, I'm just removing the bulk of it again to kind of define the shape of these leaves. Get right down into that corner. Well, clean up on this one. And that's looking pretty good. There we go. Now I'll come back and I'll do the detail on the leaves. And for this, I'm going to use a number 8 gouge. It's a little deeper gouge. First cut is the inside of the leaf. Like that. And just kind of nice, easy cut. Then I'm going to go for this part, start this way. And now I am cutting. It works best to cut this way because you're cutting with the grain again. And then I can come back and do this one. Okay, you get kind of a nice effect. Now for this one I'm going to have to go back this way to cut with the grain again. And that's just kind of have figured out the way to cut that just as I've carved this piece of wood. I just know that's the way that the grain is going. Again, I'm not even worried about that little chunk. I'll get that just a sec. I'm just removing kind of the excess. And so, oftentimes for this, I'll use this kind of sliding cut. It kind of cuts nicely across the grain without tearing out. There we go. Right, almost there. Trouble there. I cut that a little deep. I can clean that up though. Final. Just use that other cut there to remove a little extra to make this cut easier. I can just kind of work my way in until I meet it. There we go. There we go. Let's see, I need my 12. This one I ended up making this cut a little too deep with that gouge. So I come back, move just a little more, clean that up. Like that. Now, I'm going to come back, where did I put it? Number 5. And for this part, what I'm going to do is I'll make a relief cut here and come in at an angle like that. Just to define that leaf a little more. And then you can just come back and cut the other side of that leaf out. There we go. There's that. Then what I'll do is I'm going to take my number 7 again, just to define this section of leaf a little bit more. Come in with this one, do one like that, and one cut like that. That will make that little side leaf come out. sort of like that. So come back in and do this cut here, and then this cut here. And sometimes, like these cuts, they're pretty tiny, so you gotta just kind of work carefully. It's real easy to get maybe a little too much of a cut and end up breaking out chunks. And if you do, you just kind of adjust to fit what you need to. All right. This cut right there. This cut. That one, and then come back and clean out that one piece. And just defining those leaves. You kind of see them a little more. Yes. And if you have any questions on what you might want to carve or how to carve something, let me know. We'll see if we can work a way out to help you get it carved. The biggest thing is it just takes practice. You know, I'm a big fan of Bob Ross. You can definitely, if you're interested, get good at carving. And there's so many different types of carving. Some are certainly more difficult than others. They all have their own challenges, but I think you know, with some practice, you'd be surprised how quickly, I'm guessing, you can start carving some things you're really proud of. And so now I'm going to go back, do just some little detail lines. So this one first, and I like to use my mallet for this because I can just do little tiny lines. Take it really slow, like that. I'm going to do one in here. Just kind of follow that, and slow, tiny little line. Just adds a neat detail in there. That. There's no hurry. Start really tiny lines and work your way up. You can always go back and add a little more. Once you've carved it, it's gone. Okay, even that one, I got a little wiggle in there, so I'll kind of come back and touch it up. There we go. All right. That is pretty good. I'm going to leave it a little bit rougher. I could go back. There's always, you know, you can always go back and clean up even more. Sometimes I'll go back and, you know, try to get this a little more. Go anywhere you see that maybe it looks you're not happy with, go in, do a little more, clean that up. I do, like I said, like to leave oftentimes some marks, just because then it is hand carved. You kind of want it to have some details that where you even maybe messed up. It's kind of fun to see that. And over time, you know, you get better at hiding your mistakes, but no matter what, it happens. You make mistakes. And then one of my final details that I find just really kind of cleans it up easily is a wire brush. So I'll come back and kind of gently, you know, go in there and get some of that. It kind of pulls a lot of those little fuzz spots out, gets it kind of cleaned up. Doesn't take much, I just do a real kind of light, but it kind of gets down in there and cleans like that. There we go. All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll do another carving, and yeah, send me some comments. Let me know what you guys think, what you'd like to see, what you're having trouble with. Send me pictures of what you do. And yeah, thank you very much. Have a great day.